Hello again. So recapping from the morning swim, we have grandmother and Sophia, and they have sort of a special relationship. And what's funny about them is that neither of them is in a position of authority. The one who seems to be calling the shots is Sophia's father, right? And this isn't so much about sexism, it's just that this is a little girl and an older lady, right? So even though they're at opposite ends of life, they actually have a lot in common with regards to the power that they hold, right? So the father, he's at an age where he's an adult, but he's young enough to be mobile. So he's the one that makes the rules, right? If you're into, things like power. Yeah. Like you can get into it with gender, of course, right? That he's calling the shots because he's the man, but it's also because of youth and old age. Okay. Moonlight. One time in April, there was a full moon, and the sea was covered with ice. Sophia woke up and remembered that they had come back to the island and that she had a bed to herself because her mother was dead. The fire was still burning in the stove, and the flames flickered on the ceiling, where the boots were hung up to dry. She climbed down to the floor, which was very cold, and looked out through the window. The ice was black, and in the middle of the ice she saw the open stove door and the fire. In fact, she saw two stove doors very close together. In the second window, the two fires were burning underground, and through the third window she saw a double reflection of the whole room, trunks and chests and boxes with gaping lids. They were filled with moss and snow and dry grass, all of them open, with bottoms of coal-black shadow. She saw two children out on the rock, and there was a rowan tree growing right through them. The sky behind them was dark blue. She lay down in her bed and looked at the fire dancing on the ceiling, and all the time the island seemed to be coming closer and closer to the house. They were sleeping by a meadow near the shore with patches of snow on the covers, and under them the ice darkened and began to glide. A channel opened very slowly in the floor, and all their luggage floated out in the river of the moonlight. All the suitcases were open and full of darkness and moss, and none of them ever came back. Sophia reached out her hand and pulled her grandmother's plait very gently. Grandmother woke up instantly. "Listen," Sophia whispered. "I saw two fires in the window. Why are there two fires instead of one?" Her grandmother thought for a moment and said, "It's because we have double windows." After a while, Sophia asked, "Are you sure the door is closed?" "It's open," her grandmother said. "It's always open. You can sleep quite easy." Sophia rolled up in the quilt. She let the whole island float out on the ice and onto the horizon. Just before she fell asleep, her father got up and put more wood in the stove. Okay, very short chapter. The reader gets a little information, and we see something that perhaps we can connect with. Maybe it's not exactly looking through a window, but we see a little girl figuring out how the world works, right? Why do we see what we see? So again, this is another book where we are considering the child's perspective. So we have room, ocean at the end of the lane, right? So Sophia, she's studying the world, right? And she's feeling sad. Like without Tove Jansson having to say, Sophia is sad. We know that she is. She reaches out to her grandmother, right? The grandmother doesn't have to say anything directly. She knows what's going on. Perhaps in your bedrooms, if you remember when you were little, the play of shadows. Things look one way at night and another during the day. So this is sort of the experience. Like it's nighttime, And we've seen a lot of texts where nighttime is significant, so it's when we are oftentimes alone. Here, Sophia is not alone, she's with her grandmother, right? And this could be the custom. This could be because she needs the company, and this is a special arrangement. And we do have the figure of the father. So the father, so far, he hasn't said anything. So we can explore all sorts of ideas about fatherhood and how it's lived, like what is normal fatherhood, what is good fatherhood, what is effective fatherhood. Also bearing in mind that Sophia's father has lost his wife, so he's sad in his own way. And also, well, this was published in the 1970s, right? So it's a different culture back then, what men were and were not expected to do. It's a different time, it's a different culture. So when we consider characters in their setting, we cannot be judging them based on today's standards. We have to understand what was going on at that time. Okay, because that was quite a short chapter, I'm going to move on to the next one. The Magic Forest. On the outside of the island, beyond the bare rock, there was a stand of dead forest. It lay right in the path of the wind, and for many hundreds of years had tried to grow directly into the teeth of every storm, and had thus acquired an appearance all its own. From a passing boat, it was obvious that each tree was stretching away from the wind. They crouched and twisted, and many of them crept. Eventually, the trunks broke or rotted and then sank, the dead trees supporting or crushing those still green at the top. Altogether, they formed a tangled mass of stubborn resignation. The ground was shiny with brown needles, except where the spruces had decided to crawl instead of stand, their greenery luxuriating in a kind of frenzy, damp and glossy as if in a jungle. This forest was called the Magic Forest. It had shaped itself with slow and laborious care, and the balance between survival and extinction was so delicate that even the smallest change was unthinkable. To open a clearing or separate the collapsing trunks might lead to the ruin of the magic forest. The marshy spots could not be drained, and nothing could be planted behind the dense, sheltering wall of trees. Deep under this thicket, in places where the sun never shone, there lived birds and small animals. In calm weather you could hear the rustle of wings and hastily scurrying feet, but the animals never showed themselves. In the beginning, the family tried to make the magic forest more terrible than it was. They collected stumps and dry juniper bushes from the neighboring islands and rode them back to the forest. Huge specimens of weathered, whitened beauty were dragged across the island. They splintered and cracked and made broad, empty paths to the places where they were to stand. Grandmother could see that it wasn't turning out right, but she said nothing. Afterwards, she cleaned the boat and waited until the rest of the family tired of the magic forest. Then she went in by herself. She crawled slowly, past the marsh and the ferns, and when she got tired, she lay down on the ground and looked up through the network of gray lichens and branches. Later, the others asked her where she had been, and she replied that maybe she had slept a little while. Except for the magic forest, the island became an orderly, beautiful park. They tidied it down to the smallest twig while the earth was still soaked with spring rain, and after that they stuck carefully to the narrow paths that wandered through the carpet of moss from one granite outcropping to another and down to the sand beach. Only farmers and summer guests walk on the moss. What they don't know, and it cannot be repeated too often, is that moss is terribly frail. Step on it once and it rises the next time it rains. The second time, it doesn't rise back up. And the third time you step on moss, it dies. Eider ducks are the same way. The third time you frighten them up from their nests, they never come back. Sometime in July, the moss would adorn itself with a kind of long, light grass, Tiny clusters of flowers would open at exactly the same height above the ground and sway together in the wind, like inland meadows, and the whole island would be covered with a veil dipped in heat, hardly visible and gone in a week. Nothing could give a stronger impression of untouched wilderness. Grandmother sat in the magic forest and carved outlandish animals. She cut them from branches and driftwood and gave them paws and faces, but she only hinted at what they looked like and never made them too distinct. They retained their wooden soles, and the curve of their backs and legs had the enigmatic shape of growth itself and remained a part of the decaying forest. Sometimes she cut them directly out of a stump or the trunk of a tree. Her carvings became more and more numerous. They clung to trees or sat astride the branches. They rested against the trunks or settled into the ground. With outstretched arms they sank in the marsh, or they curled up quietly and slept by a root. Sometimes they were only a profile in the shadows, and sometimes there were 2 or 3 together, entwined in battle or in love. Grandmother worked only in old wood that had already found its form. That is, she saw and selected those pieces of wood that expressed what she wanted them to say. One time she found a big white vertebra in the sand. It was too hard to work, but could not have been made any prettier anyway, so she put it in the magic forest as it was. She found more bones, white or gray, all washed ashore by the sea. "What is it you're doing?" Sophia asked. "I'm playing," Grandmother said. Sophia crawled into the magic forest and saw everything her grandmother had done. "Is it an exhibit?" she asked. But Grandmother said it had nothing to do with sculpture. Sculpture was another thing completely. They started gathering bones together along the shore. Gathering is peculiar because you see nothing but what you're looking for. If you're picking raspberries, you see only what's red, and if you're looking for bones, you see only the white. No matter where you go, the only thing you see is bones. Sometimes they are as thin as needles, extremely fine and delicate, and have to be handled with great care. Sometimes they are large, heavy thigh bones or a cage of ribs buried in the sand like the timbers of a shipwreck. Bones come in 1,000 shapes, and every one of them has its own structure. Sophia and Grandmother carried everything they found to the magic forest. They would usually go at sundown. They decorated the ground under the trees with bone arabesques like ideographs, and when they finished their patterns, they would sit for a while and talk, and listen to the movements of the birds in the thicket. Once they flushed a grouse, and another time they saw a tiny owl. It was sitting on a branch, silhouetted against the evening sky. No one had ever seen an owl on the island before. One morning, Sophia found a perfect skull of some large animal. Found it all by herself. Grandmother thought it was a seal's skull. They hid it in a basket and waited all day until evening. The sunset was in different shades of red, and the light flooded in over the whole island so that even the ground turned scarlet. They put the skull in the magic forest, and it lay on the ground and gleamed with all its teeth. Suddenly Sophia began to scream. "Take it away!" she screamed. "Take it away!" Grandmother picked her up and held her, but thought it best not to say anything. After a while Sophia went to sleep. Grandmother sat and thought about building a matchbox house on the sandy beach by the blueberry patch behind the house. They could build a dock and make windows out of tin foil. And so the wooden animals were allowed to vanish into their forest. The arabesques sank into the ground and turned green with moss, and the trees slipped deeper and deeper into each other's arms as time went by. Grandmother often went to the magic forest when the sun went down, but in the daytime she sat on the veranda steps and made boats of bark. So, this is, of course, a very environmentally minded chapter, right? We see people cohabiting with this magic forest. We get a sense of the passage of time of this family that has a particular culture. They are Finnish, and this is how Finns relate to nature. They're very respectful, they don't disturb it, they enjoy it, and they appreciate the wilderness, right? They do take care of the island where they live, but wild things also have their value. Significant moment, of course, is when Sophia becomes upset. And we don't have a direct explanation of what's going on, but perhaps we can infer that this is a little girl. She has lost her mother. She doesn't understand exactly how death works, but she knows that it exists. And of course, we associate bones with death. The grandmother's using them for art. There's something nowadays called bio-art that I don't know if they had back then, but basically it consists of using living things in art pieces. So for instance, you can have like a branch and intentionally, so like art requires intention. Intentionally, you can put like some ants on there and it becomes a piece of art. So we have the grandmother who is who's based off Tove Jansson's mother, and Tove Jansson's mother was an artist. So she's playing. So we have this idea of play being not just for children, it's for adults as well, right? And she has no trouble manipulating these bones that we usually associate with death. But as an older woman, she has accepted that death is a part of life, and she's made her peace with it. But from the point of view of Sophia, when you're young, death is a very upsetting idea, right? It's terrifying. And for Sophia, it's much more of an immediate thing. She's lost her mother. She knows that you can lose the people who take care of her. And a possible fear of hers is she going to lose anyone else, right? So if you think back to the swimming chapter, right, that Sophia asked her grandmother if when she's going to die, right? That could be a thoughtless question, or it could come as a result of what she's going through. Yeah, so it's quiet, it's sort of calm, tranquil. But we know, like, we know what's going on in the physical world, what's going on the island, but we're also thinking about what's going on in people's minds, in the characters' minds. Yeah. So see me next chapter with the Scolder.